In 1853 to 54, United States Navy Commodore Matthew Perry opened Japan's isolated island empire to Western trade. Aboard Perry's ship was a miniature steam train engine and a section of track. As the Japanese emissaries watched with fascination, the train made simple ovals on the deck of Perry's ship. It was clear that even on the first day of the first official visit by non-Asian people in over 250 years, the West and its ideas would captivate most Japanese. Over the next 40-plus years, the Japanese went all out to import, copy, and, in some cases, improve technology in the form of industrial technology, democratic ideas, and new developments in philosophy and science. In the late 1800s, as Japan grew into a regional power, a new wave of thought from Europe began to have an effect on Japan and its people. This was eugenics, a school of thought that grew out of Darwin's theory of evolution and the famous idea that the strong survive and the weak perish. In other words, survival of the fittest. In actuality, Darwin didn't write or say that, and he argued that in many cases, weaker animals would adapt new ways to succeed in new places. The Industrial Revolution further increased the divide between rich and poor people and rich and poor nations. Unfortunately, in the time before the social safety net and regulations about child labor, education, housing, and health, the people working in the factories remained largely ignorant, unhealthy, and dirty. This was not their fault. Even the most staunch capitalists today will admit that the dirty, dangerous, and uneducated life they led was almost forced upon them by society. But before the development of sociology, many of the people at the very top of society began to look down at the rest as inherently ignorant, unclean, and dangerous. In the minds of many of those at the top, their workers would never evolve into cultured human beings. What's more, as Europeans and Americans increasingly began to be exposed to people from other countries and cultures, some of them in the poorer parts of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, an ever-growing group of scientists and intellectuals began to apply Darwin's survival of the fittest to human society. Many men and women at the top and in the growing middle class supported a new school of thought called eugenics, which comes from Greek and means born of good genes. Soon, eugenics was not only taught at universities all over the Western world, but had expanded to include weaker and less fortunate members of not only their own societies, but also the people and races of the world. To a growing number of Western Europeans, British, and white Americans, eugenics both explained their country's and culture's success and the danger of what some eugenicists began to call the lesser races, whose progress towards modernization was slow because they were inherently incapable of the same advances unless they copied them from the West. The study and development of eugenics in Europe led directly to Hitler's policy of racial discrimination and genocide in the 1930s and 40s. By the end of the first decade of the 1900s, Japan had almost completely modernized its industry and was fast growing into a world power. Moreover, they had defeated both China 1894-95 and Russia in 1904-1905 and successfully established themselves as a relatively democratic nation with a government based on Western models. Until China's successes in the last 30 years, Japan's development between 1871 and the modernizing Emperor Meiji took power, and the early 20th century was perhaps the most miraculous and rapid in human history. They had gone from a country that had been isolated for 250 years, used swords, and had never seen a steam train, to a regional power with its eyes on other parts of Asia. In contrast, most people in China, Korea, Taiwan, and others in Asia were living in desperate poverty. To many in Japan, especially those following trends in modern science, it was clear that the Japanese, at least in Asia, were the superior race. Not only were the Japanese gains in industry, science, and much else a factor in their thinking, but so was their society, a highly organized and orderly one, in which people pulled together for the good of all. Soon, the ideas of eugenics were spreading throughout the upper echelons of Japanese society, in the government and the military especially. In ancient times and into the early Middle Ages, Japan was greatly influenced by ideas from China, Much of it, including writing, religion, and clothing, came to Japan from China. By the time the samurai had become the powerful ruling class of the country around the year 1100, outside influence began to wane, and Japan developed into one of the most isolated and unique societies in the world. The unique nature of Japanese society, the influence of the samurai warriors' rule and ideas, and its successes in the wars of the early 1900s all combined with Western thinking about society and evolution. And by the time of the First World War, eugenics had taken root in Japan. Japanese eugenics pointed to the so-called backward nature of Chinese and Korean societies, as well as their defeats in war, as a sign that the Asian people were, or had become, weak. In the minds of eugenicists in Europe, America, and Japan, people became weak when they allowed so-called lesser people to reproduce without limit. Two things had to happen to combat this. One, a strong government needed to take power, and the Japanese military was in charge by the early 1930s. The second thing was that physically and intellectually challenged people or races should be limited in the amount of children they had, if they were allowed to have any at all. By the 1920s, and indeed by the early 30s, eugenic ideas had become popular among the ruling class of Japan, if not mainstream, and a series of public education campaigns were launched with the idea that they would encourage the right people to reproduce and the wrong people to avoid pregnancy. Marriage and child-rearing were encouraged for the military class and the growing wealthy middle class, but contraception was encouraged among workers, the uneducated, and one particular group of foreigners who had been living in Japan for centuries: Koreans. The people at the top were regarded by eugenicists and a growing number of people as members of a pure race, children of the Sun Goddess Amaterasu, whose isolation had allowed them to avoid polluting and dangerous ideas from the outside until a unique and superior Japanese society emerged. To a large degree, Japanese ideas about human culture and their place in it were remarkably similar to that of Nazi Germany. Japanese were at the top, and everyone else was beneath them. World War II in Asia began when Japan invaded China in the late 1930s. By that time, Japanese society was a highly regimented fascist state, and this is when eugenics in Japan became public policy. Sterilization and segregation of people who were deemed unfit became policy. In 1940, the military pushed through the National Eugenic Law, the law that allowed the government to forcibly sterilize both the severely physically challenged, those with epilepsy, muscular dystrophy, etc., and the mentally challenged as well. The person in question had no legal recourse, nor did their parents or family. At the same time, the government offered cash and tax incentives for healthy couples to have more and more children. Condoms and reproductive education programs were given to the poor and uneducated, and the Koreans who lived in some of the more squalid parts of Japan's cities. By World War II, eugenics had become synonymous with racism, not only in Japan and Germany, but in places like the United States, where eugenics laws spread throughout the 20s and 30s, and where approximately 60,000 people, primarily uneducated Southern blacks, were forcibly and legally sterilized, to Australia, where Aboriginal people were subjected to the same thing, and Canada, which had a program to sterilize members of the First Peoples there. In Germany, in the late 30s, the infamous T4 euthanasia and sterilization program took place under the guise of hospital care. Things never went that far in Japan, but the principles of eugenics were undoubtedly part of occupation policy in the Japanese Empire, especially in China. Japanese eugenicists, their believers, and quite honestly, a huge segment of the Japanese population viewed the Chinese as a once great people who had allowed themselves to degenerate into the overcrowded, desperately poor, and dirty cities that Japanese troops and visitors saw in much of China. During the war in China, programs to both sterilize and kill the Chinese had become government policy. Biological and chemical weapons, forced sterilizations, horrid experiments, and murder in the streets were the results of Japanese ideas of eugenics. Though the killing wasn't done in the monstrously industrial way that the Nazis killed their so-called enemies in the extermination camps, they managed to kill upwards of 20 million people in occupied China. In Japan itself, during the war, tens of thousands of people were forcibly sterilized. Naturally, this was likely the most traumatic event of the victims' lives, ordered by the court and taken by the military for an operation they did not want, which wiped out their family line forever. But the amazing thing is that eugenics laws remained on the books after World War II. From 1945 to 48, the U.S. military ruled and governed in Japan. In 1948, a significant degree of self-government was returned to the Japanese. One of the things that went back into action was the eugenics laws. This time, the targets were primarily the mentally disabled. Abortion was also allowed in the case of severe mental or physical handicaps. A number of poorly educated Korean workers living in Japan were also taken to be made infertile. Though the procedures sometimes involved the physical removal of the testicles, both men and women were most often subject to surgical sterilizations, tubal ligations in women, and vasectomies for men. These procedures are reversible, but most victims were not given that information. It's estimated that nearly 17,000 people were sterilized against their will between 1948 and 1996, when the last eugenics laws were finally revoked. And before you look at Japan's history of eugenics and point too many fingers, the last eugenics laws were taken off the books in North Carolina and Iowa in 2013 and 2014, though by that time they were rarely used. Thank you for watching. See you next time.